Well, we just got new information on Capitano. It's tied directly to version 6.4, and it strongly suggests that we're going to see him again in the story. So in this video, I want to break down exactly what changed in 6.4, where this new information comes from, and why people suddenly started paying attention again. I'll explain how this connects to Varka's story quest, why Roland matters in the same update, and how even Columbina's dialogue still treats Capitano as an active figure. By the end, you'll know what's actually new, what's still uncertain, and why Hoyoverse clearly hasn't moved on from Capitano yet. Let's start with what's new, because that's the real reason this conversation came back. In version 6.4, data tied to Varka's story quest shows a voiced line that references Capitano directly. This isn't profile text, and it's not optional lore hidden in menus. It's part of the story quest dialogue itself, meaning it went through the full writing, recording, and localization process. That alone makes it worth talking about, because Hoyoverse doesn't casually add new voiced story content for characters they consider finished. What makes this stand out is the timing. This voice line exists after the Archon quest, where many players believed Capitano died. Despite that, he's still being referenced in new, fully voiced story content. The line count data shows that Capitano only has one recorded line in the quest, but that doesn't make it insignificant. The important part is that he's still present in the quest structure at all, and that presence is deliberate. At the same time, the same source points to a roughly 3-minute cutscene in Varka's story quest where Capitano appears prominently. That doesn't mean extended dialogue, and it doesn't mean a fight is guaranteed. What it does mean is that this isn't a background mention or a short callback. 3 minutes is long enough to be a proper cinematic sequence, and those don't exist without planning. Now, to understand why this matters, we need to briefly revisit where the idea that Capitano is dead even came from. During the Archon quest, Capitano offers himself as a substitute in a ley line contract that requires a sacrifice. That word, sacrifice, is where most of the misunderstanding started. The quest never shows Capitano being destroyed. His body is not erased. It doesn't disappear. Instead, we're told his soul becomes bound to Renova, while his body remains intact and breathing on the throne of primal fire. That's not how permanent death is usually shown in Genshin Impact. We've seen permanent death before. Signora's case is very clear. Her body was destroyed, her vision shattered. There was no continuation afterward. Capitano's situation was handled differently, and the game has continued to treat him differently since then. This becomes even more obvious when you look at how other characters talk about him. Columbina, for example, continues to reference Capitano in present tense. The wording isn't framed as remembering someone who is gone. It's framed as speaking about someone who still exists. That's not accidental writing, and it matches what we're now seeing in 6.4 with his continued inclusion in story content. Now let's talk about Varka's story quest itself, because Capitano doesn't appear in isolation here. Version 6.4 heavily centers on Mondstadt's past, and one name that comes up repeatedly is Roland, also known as the Bloodstained Knight. Roland is not a new character created for this update. He's been part of Mondstadt lore for a long time, appearing in artifact descriptions and historical records. He was a former Knight of Favonius, connected to the older generation of Mondstadt heroes, and closely tied to figures like Rostam and Boreas. Roland's story is important because it mirrors the kind of conflict Varka represents. Roland was obsessed with justice to the point where he lost control. Over time, that obsession turned him into something violent, and he eventually died centuries ago. His legacy remained, but his story never had a clean resolution. In the 6.4 story quest data, Roland has a very large number of dialogue lines, second only to Varka himself. That tells us this quest is not just about introducing Varka as a playable character. It's about confronting Mondstadt's past, its legends, and the consequences of absolute ideals. Roland is not treated as a side note. He's treated as a central figure within the quest. This context matters when Capitano appears, even briefly. Capitano and Varka have been linked in the lore for a long time as figures of strength, discipline, and reputation. The fact that Capitano shows up in a quest focused on legacy, justice, and past conflicts is not random placement. It fits the narrative space Varka's quest is exploring. Now, let's address the topic everyone asks about directly: playability. There has never been a solid statement saying Capitano is permanently unplayable. Past insider comments only stated that there were no playable plans at the time, or that he wouldn't release during Natlan. Those statements were specific to timing, not to his overall future. That distinction matters. We've seen characters stay unplayable for long stretches before returning later in a different context. There was also a period where Capitano had an NPC-only identifier. That caused a lot of concern, but NPC flags are not permanent markers. They're placeholders. Several playable characters went through similar stages before their release. As for claims about release windows, older discussions referenced version 6.x, but the game's structure has shifted with Nodcry and its internal arc progression. It's more accurate now to think in terms of story eras rather than version numbers. And in this current era, Capitano is still being referenced, still appearing in story content, and still being treated as relevant. That's the key point here. The new 6.4 voice line doesn't prove Capitano will be playable. It doesn't undo what happened in the Archon quest. It doesn't lock in a future banner. What it does show is that Hoyoverse is still actively using Capitano in the story. Characters who are fully done don't get new story quest dialogue, new cinematics, and continued present tense references across multiple updates. Before wrapping up, it's worth clearing up the older information around Capitano's playability. Some past leaks mentioned a possible release in 6.x, but that wording doesn't map cleanly anymore now that the story has shifted into Nodcry with its own arc structure. What those sources were really pointing to was a later era of the game, not a specific banner. More importantly, no credible leak has ever said Capitano is permanently unplayable. Insiders only clarified that he wouldn't release during Natlan, meaning 5.x, not that he was removed entirely. Earlier comments like no playable plans at the time were exactly that. Time-specific, not final. Even the NPC-only ID he once had was a temporary placeholder, not a definitive decision. There was also a claim from Flying Flame about future playability. That claim remains questionable and unconfirmed, but it hasn't been denied either, and it lines up with the idea of delay rather than cancellation, combined with the fact that Hoyoverse continues to invest in Capitano through cinematics and ongoing story references. The past information consistently points to an unfinished arc, not a closed one. So the real takeaway from all of this is simple. Capitano is not being treated as a closed chapter. He's still part of the narrative, still tied to major characters, and still appearing in meaningful story content. Now I want to hear your take. Do you see this 6.4 appearance as a small callback, or as another sign that his story is still moving forward? Drop your thoughts in the comments because this topic clearly isn't going away anytime soon. And if you want more breakdowns like this, where new information actually gets put into context instead of blown out of proportion, make sure you're subscribed. There's more to unpack as version 6.4 continues.